My name is Jacob. I live in Jerusalem. I have a nice house. Never mind where it is. I'm a merchant. I am a purveyor of fine foods and delicacies, and I deal in rare artifacts. I also host dinners for influential people. And for me, Passover is a very busy time because we can have 100,000 pilgrims in town just for Passover. So there's a lot of money to be made. I should also mention that I met Jesus. I met him a couple of times, and in fact, I had him to dinner on the day of preparation. One of his friends, a Pharisee named Joseph, who was from Arimathea, Joseph told me that I should go see this Jesus who was preaching out in the country, and I went to see him, and I thought he was interesting enough. I saw him a couple of times, I think, and then Joseph said to me, Passover is coming, so you really should invite him to your house to have the dinner. I didn't really know Jesus that well. But I knew that there could be problems inviting him. I had done work for Joseph before, and Joseph had done work for me, so I did what he asked. Now, having somebody like Jesus and his followers come to dinner is just not a simple matter. Not in Jerusalem, not when you're under the very nose of the Sanhedrin and the Roman procurator, Pilate. It's not a simple matter when it's just a couple of days after that big fuss that was made when he came into town on Sunday. He came into town riding on a donkey, and the people were lined up on the street waving palms. Some of them were throwing the palms down in the street, and some of them were throwing their cloaks down in the street so that the donkey wouldn't be touching the ground. They treated him like an arriving king, a conquering warrior. And the Romans saw all of this. The priests saw all of this. You could almost feel the tension building in the city. It's always a little crazy as it gets toward Passover, but to have this happening wasn't good. So knowing that it was maybe a little treacherous, we used what we call a cutout. You know what a cutout is? A cutout is somebody who's an intermediary. When you have a business deal going on that maybe isn't quite as on the up and up as it should be. Because between two parties, you have a cutout who works in the middle. And he doesn't know very much about either one. So if something happens to him, he can't give away too much. That's what we used. It was all very cloak and dagger, but it was very necessary for somebody in my position, because I had this feeling that it was not healthy to be a follower of Jesus, or even to really know him. I didn't know what was going to be happening, but I knew it wasn't good. So how it worked was this way. The disciples came into town. Jesus told them to look for a man carrying a big water jug. That man was the cutout. And that man was easy to spot because carrying water was woman's work. No man would do that given a choice. So the disciples spotted that man, and that man did the only thing he knew to do. He brought them to my house. He didn't know who I was. He introduced them to the servant at my house. And after he left, then the servant brought the disciples to me. And it all sounds very sneaky, and it all was very sneaky, but it was necessary. Because these were dangerous times, and I just had to protect myself. But once the disciples were there, and they were men that I knew, I had seen them when I went and saw Jesus out in the country. Once the other man left, we set up the room. We set it up. It was a typical banquet room in my upper room. It was a long, kind of U-shaped table. There were couches all the way around the table so that people could recline like civilized people do when they eat. And we got the food ready, and we got the wine ready. Everything was in readiness, and then the disciples sent word that Jesus could come. So Jesus and the rest of the disciples and the rest of the followers that were with them came to the house, and they came in small groups, so it wouldn't be obvious. We didn't want a whole mass of people moving through the streets up to my house. That would have been a dead giveaway. Jesus himself was cloaked so as not to draw attention, because a lot of people knew him after Sunday. But eventually, at the appointed time, everybody had arrived, and they all went up to the upper room and took their places. Jesus was at the center of the table. The rest of the disciples sort of jockeyed for position the way I suppose they always did. Who was going to sit at his right? Who was going to sit at his left? Who would be the farthest away? These were all things that had to be worked out. And finally, everything was ready. So I called my servants in, and they began to serve the food, and I watched back in the corner. And the disciples and Jesus talked among themselves. And I don't remember much about the conversation because I was busy making sure everything worked, making sure everything flowed. But I know it sounded like Jesus was trying very hard to sum up everything that he had been teaching them over the last 3 years. It sounded like this was a session where he was trying to just cram everything he had ever taught them into this one dinner. He seemed worried. And I remember thinking to myself, he should be worried. He's making a lot of powerful enemies. But he also started to make me a little nervous too. And then he did something that was really weird. He took the bread, he broke it. He gave a blessing over the bread. And then he handed it to his disciples and said, "Take this and eat. This is my body." And I thought that was very strange. And then he took the wine and he blessed it again. And he took the wine in a cup and he gave it to his disciples and he said, "Drink this. This is my blood. This is my blood, which is shed for you and for many for remission of sins." And I thought, this is very strange. This is not part of the normal ritual we have for this dinner. And the disciples thought it was kind of strange too. You could see it on their faces. And then the talk got around to Jesus saying that one of them was going to betray him. And you could see that they were very alarmed at that, and I was very alarmed too, because I didn't want him getting betrayed in my house. I didn't need that aggravation. But as they're talking, Jesus is saying, I'm going to die. And one of you is going to be the reason. That sort of puts a damper on the dinner conversation. Because Nothing says the party is over like the guest of honor announcing that he's about to die. So the dinner didn't go on much longer after that. Some of them left, I think. And eventually, when the conversation was done and the food was gone, the disciples left. Again, they left in small groups, so as not to be obvious that I don't know where they went, and I didn't want to know where they went. Later that night, early the next morning, Joseph came to me and told me that Jesus had been arrested. And I did the first thing I could think of. I packed a few things, put some money together, just in case I might have to leave suddenly. And then I listened for that knock on the door that would tell me the authorities had come, but it never came. When there was finally a knock at the door, it was in daylight, and it was a couple of women that I recognized as followers of Jesus, and they were there to tell me he had been arrested, and I said, yes, I know. And then they told me that Jesus was right then being put on trial in the Fortress Antonia where Pontius Pilate was. And that Pontius Pilate had offered to free either Jesus or Barabbas. Barabbas was a murdering thug. And these women wanted me to come and cheer for Jesus, to be part of the crowd chanting for Jesus, for Pilate to free him. And I hesitated, and they begged me, and I said, okay, I'll think about it. And they left, and then I did think about it for about maybe 10 seconds. Seriously, they had no idea what it would mean for a man like me to be seen in that crowd. They had no idea what it would mean to a man like me to be seen as a supporter of Jesus, the enemy of the state. If anybody spotted me, I would be ruined. My business would be ruined. My world would be destroyed. I would end up either dead or in prison. Probably my family with me. I had no interest in ending up dead the way I knew he was going to. So I didn't go. Later on, I ran into Peter, one of his men. He was kind of a blowhard. But I ran into Peter, and he just looked at me, and I immediately needed to defend myself. I said, if I had been there, it wouldn't have made any difference to him. But it would have made a difference to me because I would have been risking my life. I said, Jesus was a reasonable man. He couldn't possibly expect somebody to put his life on the line for another person. He couldn't possibly expect someone to be willing to die so that somebody else would live. And Peter just looked at me and said, "You are wrong." And I know that now. And he left. He said, "You're wrong," but I knew better. I knew better because I know that kind of love, that willingness to sacrifice yourself, that just doesn't exist, does it? At least that's what I like to tell myself.